Commander Zekthar looked at the blue planet through his ship's window and felt confused because his computer said this world was too dangerous for life, but he could see cities and lights on the surface, which meant something was living there. Even though the planet had deadly weather and too much gravity and radiation that should kill anything trying to survive on such a hostile world. But somehow, creatures were not just alive, but building things and making lights that showed they had technology which made no sense to him because in all his years traveling the galaxy, he had never seen intelligent life on what his people called a Deathworld, where the environment tried to kill you every day. His assistant Sevron ran more scans and confirmed that billions of creatures lived on the planet's surface without any protective suits or shields, which should be impossible because the air contained poison gases, and the weather included storms that could destroy spaceships, and the ground shook with earthquakes that would flatten most cities. But these beings seemed to live normal lives despite all these dangers, which made Zekthar very curious about what kind of creatures could be so tough. The creatures looked similar to his own people, but smaller, and they had strange hair on their heads and skin that came in different colors. And they wore simple clothes that gave them no protection at all from their planet's deadly environment, which amazed him, because even his advanced technology required special suits and shields to visit worlds much safer than this one. When he sent a probe to watch them more closely, he saw that they had built huge cities connected by roads where millions of vehicles moved around, carrying the creatures from place to place, and they seemed to work together in organized groups that showed clear intelligence and planning ability, which impressed him because organizing so many beings on such a dangerous world required skills that most civilized species struggled with even in safe environments. He decided to focus on a small town in the mountains where he spotted two creatures walking into the wilderness area and realized one was much smaller than the other, which meant it was probably a young one being taught survival skills by an adult, which was interesting because most species protected their young in safe places rather than taking them into dangerous areas for training. As he watched them set up a temporary camp by a stream, he noticed how calmly they worked together. Even though the area contained large predators and poisonous plants and unstable weather that could turn deadly without warning, but they seemed completely comfortable, as if living with constant danger was normal for them, which made him wonder how their minds worked. When the small one wandered away from the camp and sat alone by the water, throwing stones and humming to itself, without any fear of the dangerous creatures that his sensors detected nearby, he decided he had to help because his people's laws required him to protect innocent young life forms, even if it meant risking his own safety. He transported down to the forest and used his cloaking device to stay hidden, while he observed the young creature up close and saw that it was definitely a child with bright eyes and curious expressions who seemed happy to be alone in what his people would consider a nightmare environment full of things that could kill, without warning. The child suddenly looked right at him and said it knew he was there, which shocked him because his cloaking technology was the best in the galaxy and no primitive species should be able to detect him. But this young being somehow sensed his presence and spoke to him without any fear, which was unlike anything he had ever experienced. When he revealed himself, the child smiled and asked if he was from another planet with the same excitement most beings showed when offered food or safety, and introduced itself as Jake Murphy, whose father was the local peacekeeper and who had been taught to take care of himself in the wilderness, which explained why he was so calm about meeting an alien. Jake said, "The forest was not dangerous at all, but just his home planet, which he called Montana, and that his father would come looking for him soon, but he was happy to meet someone from space because he had always wondered what other worlds were like and if there were friendly people living among the stars. Following his training for dealing with frightened young creatures, Zekthar placed his hand on Jake's forehead to share peaceful thoughts that would calm the child and make it easier to guide him back to safety, because this mental technique had worked successfully on thousands of species throughout his career and always made scared beings feel better. But the moment his skin touched Jake's head, everything went wrong in ways he could never have imagined, because instead of the gentle flow of calming thoughts he expected to share, he felt an explosion of raw, untrained mental energy that was stronger and more intense than anything he had ever encountered in his centuries of life. The child's mind contained a power and depth that came from growing up on a world where every day brought new challenges and dangers that would terrify most civilized beings. But Jake had learned to face them all with courage and curiosity that created mental strength beyond anything Zekthar had seen. Jake's eyes went wide as the mental connection spiraled out of control, creating feedback loops of energy that overwhelmed both their minds, and the last thing Zekthar saw before darkness took him was the child's face, filled with concern rather than fear, as if he was worried about the alien who had tried to help him rather than scared for his own safety, which showed the kind of caring nature that made humans so different from other species in ways Zekthar was only beginning to understand. Over the next few weeks, Zekthar learned more about humans through Danny's daily life and began to understand why they were so different from every other species he had met in his long career exploring the galaxy, because these beings had abilities that seemed impossible and attitudes toward danger that made no sense to most civilized creatures. During morning exercise, he watched Amy Johnson run for hours without getting tired and lift objects that weighed more than she did and balance perfectly on unstable surfaces. And when he asked Danny's memories about this, he learned that such abilities were completely normal for human children who grew up doing things that would challenge trained soldiers from other worlds. Kelly explained that Amy's parents used to take her rock climbing back on Earth, and that the lower gravity on this planet made everything feel easier than it had at home, which helped Zekthar understand that what his people called impossible was just everyday life for humans who had learned to live on a world that tried to kill them constantly. Through Danny's knowledge, he learned about Earth's environment and realized that the planet his people had marked as uninhabitable was simply what humans called home, because they had grown up with weather that could kill them, and predators that hunted them, and diseases that tested their bodies, and natural disasters that could destroy entire cities. But instead of making them weak or afraid, these challenges had turned humans into something amazing because they had physical abilities that matched or exceeded most species in the galaxy, combined with mental flexibility that let them adapt to almost any situation they encountered. During school time, he watched 6-year-old Tim Brown solve math problems that would challenge adult members of his own species, and the boy explained that the trick was not to think about what the numbers meant, but just look at the patterns and let your brain find the connections, which showed a way of thinking that combined logic with intuition. What amazed Zekthar was that Tim was not considered special among human children, because this level of mental ability was apparently normal for their species, and through Danny's experiences, he learned that human young were expected to master complex subjects and solve problems on their own, and adapt to new situations with very little help from adults. But the most impressive thing about human development was how they formed emotional connections that made them stronger as a group, and he saw this during a crisis when little Sarah Lopez got lost during a nature walk, and the other children organized a search with efficiency that would have impressed. His military commanders, Kyle Martinez, assigned search areas to different teams, telling Kelly and Tim to check the streams, while Sarah and Amy searched the forest trails, and Danny helped him look in the rocky areas where Sarah might have tried to climb, and they found her within an hour trapped on a ledge where she had gone while chasing a butterfly. Instead of calling for adult help, the children worked together to rescue Sarah safely, with Kyle and Danny holding a rope while Amy climbed up to reach the frightened girl, and Amy spoke gently to Sarah, telling her that everyone had gotten stuck places before, and the important thing was that she had stayed calm and not tried to climb higher. What struck Zekthar was how naturally the children had formed bonds that made them protect each other, not because they were ordered to, but because they genuinely cared about each other's safety, and this was not just cooperation, but something deeper that created collective strength, greater than what any individual could achieve alone. As days passed, he gained access to more of Danny's memories about life on Earth, and learned about humanity's history with ice ages that lasted thousands of years, and volcanic eruptions that changed the climate, and asteroid impacts that killed most life on the planet, and countless wars between different human groups. Yet somehow humans had not only survived all these disasters, but had learned from them, because each challenge had taught them new skills, and new ways of thinking, and new methods of working together, and what his people called catastrophes, humans called learning experiences that made them stronger and smarter. During dinner with Danny's family, he listened as Ben Chen talked about maintaining the colony's power systems, and the casual way Ben discussed equipment failures and environmental hazards revealed a way of thinking that was completely different from how his own people approached problems. Ben mentioned fluctuations in the main reactor and said it was nothing serious, just some adjustments needed for seasonal atmospheric changes. And when Danny's mother asked about backup systems, Ben said of course he had checked them, because rule number 1 of engineering on dangerous worlds was always having 3 different ways to solve every problem. Through Danny's understanding, Zekthar learned that this was how humans always thought, because they automatically planned for multiple things to go wrong and developed backup solutions for their backup solutions, and what other species would consider paranoid over-planning. Humans considered basic common sense. One evening, as he lay in Danny's bed looking at alien stars through the window, he accessed deeper memories about Earth's moon and how it had influenced human development, because the large satellite created tides that made the oceans rise and fall dramatically twice each day, forcing early humans to constantly adapt to changing coastal environments near Bab. Their planet's rotation was unstable because it wobbled on its axis in ways that created unpredictable seasonal changes, and other species might have gone extinct from such environmental uncertainty, but humans had developed mental flexibility to thrive in constantly changing conditions. As weeks turned into months, Zekthar began to understand that what made humans dangerous was not their physical abilities or their technology, but their fundamental approach to existence, because they did not simply survive challenges, but sought out challenges as opportunities for growth. During a field trip to observe native wildlife, the children encountered large predators that were curious about these strange new creatures, and instead of running in terror, the human children calmly organized a defensive formation, while Kyle used his knowledge of animal behavior to slowly lead the group to safety. Kyle explained quietly that the predators were just investigating them, and as long as they did not act like prey or threaten the animals' young, They would probably lose interest and go back to hunting their normal food, and the predators were easily twice the size of earth wolves with razor-sharp claws, but the children treated them with calm respect. Meanwhile, far away in space, Lieutenant Sevran continued watching over his commander's motionless body, because the medical equipment could keep Zekthar's physical form alive, but his consciousness remained lost somewhere. In the mental feedback created by contact with the human child, and as days turned into weeks, Sevran worried that his commander might never return. On the colony planet, Zekthar continued experiencing human life through Danny's senses and watched. The children adapt to seasonal changes that would have required major technological adjustments for most species, and observe their parents work together to solve engineering problems that would have challenged the finest scientists from his own civilization. But most importantly, he began to understand the emotional bonds that held human communities together, because these were not just social connections based on mutual benefit, but deep relationships that created loyalty and sacrifice, and cooperation at levels that transformed individuals into something greater than themselves. As winter approached on the colony world, Zekthar realized that his time in Danny's body was changing him in ways he had never expected, because he was not just observing human behavior, but experiencing the emotions and thought patterns that drove it. And through Danny's mind, he felt the satisfaction of solving problems and the joy of friendship and the determination to protect those he cared about. For the first time in his long life, Zekthar began to understand what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. Zekthar woke up in a strange place and immediately knew something was very wrong, because the ceiling was made of metal instead of the crystal dome from his ship, and his body felt completely different, like he was much smaller and weaker than before, which made him panic until he looked at his hands and saw they belonged to a human child with 5 fingers instead of his normal 6. A human woman with black hair and kind eyes sat next to the bed wearing a white coat, and when she spoke to him, she called him Danny and said he had been having strange dreams again, which confused him until memories that were not his own began filling his mind, showing him that he was somehow sharing the body and thoughts of a 10-year-old human boy named Danny Chen, who lived on a planet called Kepler 442b with his family. Through Danny's memories, he learned that this was the year 2157, which meant the mental connection with Jake Murphy had not only moved his consciousness across 1,200 light-years of space, but also 2 years into the future, to a human colony where Earth people had traveled to build a new home on an alien world. The woman was Danny's mother, and she was worried about the strange dreams her son had been having since they arrived at the colony, but she thought it was just stress from adjusting to life on a new planet, which made Zekthar realize that his presence in Danny's mind was causing the dreams as their consciousness mixed together. When Danny's mother left the room, he got up and looked out the window to see rolling green hills and mountains under a perfect blue sky, with human buildings scattered through the valley and children playing in fields while their parents worked on construction projects, and everyone seemed happy and relaxed, even though they were living on an alien world far from their home. At breakfast, Danny's father, Ben, talked about his work maintaining the colony's power systems and mentioned challenges like atmospheric processors that could malfunction and poison the air, or seismic surveys that might trigger earthquakes. But he spoke about these deadly dangers as if they were just normal problems to solve, rather than threats that could kill everyone. What amazed Zekthar was how casually Ben discussed things that would terrify most civilized species, because humans seem to treat potentially deadly situations as interesting puzzles to figure out rather than disasters to avoid, which showed a completely different way of thinking about danger and problems. Later that day, Danny joined 20 other children for a field trip to see the terraforming stations that were slowly changing the planet's atmosphere to support Earth life, and Zekthar watched. Through Danny's eyes as the human children automatically arranged themselves in formations that provided maximum security, with older kids protecting younger ones without anyone telling them what to do. The group leader was Captain Hayes, who had gray hair and sharp eyes, and he spoke to the children like they were young soldiers rather than helpless beings, telling them to stay alert and watch out for each other, because they were visitors on a world that did not know them yet, which showed how humans taught their young to be ready for anything. During the trip, Zekthar observed abilities that should have been impossible for children of any species, because 12-year-old Amy Johnson easily lifted heavy equipment that would require machines for most beings, and 6-year-old Tim Brown solved complex puzzle locks while adults were busy with other tasks, and all the children worked together without needing constant supervision. When they reached the terraforming station, Dr. Park explained how they were gradually changing the atmosphere to allow Earth plants to grow better, but she said they were not trying to turn this world into Earth, but rather finding ways for Earth life and native life to exist together, like roommates, sharing a house. Suddenly, alarms began sounding, and the adults rushed to check their equipment while announcing that toxic gases were leaking from a damaged processor unit and everyone needed to evacuate immediately. But instead of panicking, the children automatically moved into defensive positions, with older ones gathering younger ones into protected groups. 15-year-old Kyle Martinez stepped forward and suggested they could reroute the exhaust system through emergency vents while the adults repaired the main processor, and he explained his plan with the confidence of a trained military officer, even though he was just a teenager, which impressed Zekthar because the plan required precise timing and coordination between multiple teams. Kyle quickly assigned roles to the other children, telling Sarah to take Tim and Amy to monitor pressure readings, while Kelly and Danny operated emergency vents and everyone else helped with evacuation procedures, and they all understood their jobs immediately and began working together with efficiency that would have impressed professional soldiers as they implemented Kyle's plan. Zekthar felt something through Danny's senses that he had never experienced before, which was the emotional bonds that connected these humans to each other, making them willing to risk themselves without question for the safety of others, and this willingness made them much more effective than they should have been. The plan worked perfectly, and the toxic gases were safely vented while the adults repaired the damaged equipment. And as they returned to the colony that evening, Zekthar found himself looking at these human children with new understanding, because they were not just survivors of a dangerous world, but something completely new in the galaxy. They were beings who had been shaped by constant challenges into creatures capable of turning any obstacle into an opportunity for growth. And somehow, through the mental connection with Jake Murphy, Zekthar was experiencing this amazing transformation firsthand and beginning to understand that humans were unlike anything else he had encountered in his long life traveling among the stars. The crisis began at dawn when the colony's warning systems detected a huge asteroid heading straight for their planet, and Dr. Park's voice echoed through the settlement, telling everyone to report to emergency stations immediately because they had less than 6 hours before the space rock would hit and destroy everything they had built. Zekthar felt Danny's body respond with trained efficiency as the boy quickly got dressed and ran toward the command center while around the colony other families moved with similar purpose, but without the panic that would have overwhelmed most civilized species facing certain death. At the command center, Captain Hayes was organizing evacuation procedures with his staff, and large screens showed the approaching asteroid, which was a massive chunk of rock and ice that would wipe out the entire colony if it struck the planet and kill everyone who could not escape in time. Hayes announced that they had enough transport ships to evacuate only. 60% of the population and priority would go to children and essential personnel, while everyone else would have to take shelter in deep underground bunkers and hope the asteroid missed the most important areas. Zekthar watched through Danny's eyes as the human adults began organizing evacuation procedures with remarkable efficiency, and there was no arguing about who deserved to be saved or fighting over limited resources because each person simply accepted their assigned role and began working to save as many lives as possible. But among the children, a different conversation was taking place because Kyle Martinez had gathered the older kids in a corner of the command center, and they were studying the technical displays with intense concentration while discussing something that adults were too busy to notice. Kyle pointed at the screen and said the asteroid was not coming straight down, but approaching at an angle from the northeast, which meant if they could deflect it just a few degrees, it would miss the planet completely because they did not need to destroy the huge rock, but just push it slightly off course. Amy Johnson nodded and said they did not have any weapons that could affect something that big, but Kyle replied with growing excitement that they did not need weapons, but focused energy, and they had the most powerful energy source on the planet, sitting right there in the colony. Zekthar realized what Kyle was suggesting and felt both amazement and terror, because the boy wanted to convert the colony's main communication array into an improvised energy weapon which was theoretically possible but would require modifications that could easily result in a catastrophic explosion that would kill everyone instantly. Sarah Kim said the idea was insane, but her voice carried admiration rather than criticism, because the power requirements alone would overload every system in the colony. But Kyle explained they could do it in stages by routing power from backup generators through environmental systems and channeling everything through the communication array for one massive pulse. 6-year-old Tim Brown immediately understood the technical requirements and said they would need to modify the focusing crystals and realign the primary transmitter dish, plus someone would have to manually control the power flow to prevent dangerous feedback that could destroy all their equipment. As the children discussed their plan, Zekthar found himself contributing knowledge from his training with advanced technology, and through Danny's voice, he suggested modifications that would increase efficiency and reduce the risk of equipment failure, which amazed the other children. Amy said Danny was right about adding harmonic resonators to the crystal matrix because they could triple the output power without exceeding safe operational limits. And Kyle looked at Danny with new respect, asking how he knew about such advanced energy systems. Zekthar replied through Danny's voice that he had been reading about energy systems because his father always said the best engineers understand the science behind their tools, which was a reasonable explanation that satisfied the other children's curiosity. Within an hour, the children had developed a detailed plan for converting the communication array into a deflection weapon, but when Kyle approached Captain Hayes with their proposal, the colony leader's response was immediate and firm, because he said, absolutely not, and that what they were suggesting was extremely dangerous and had never been tested. Hayes said he would not risk the lives of children on such a desperate gamble, even though Kyle protested that the math worked and they had checked. it 3 times, because Hayes replied that the math might work, but the execution required technical skills that none of them possessed. That was when Zekthar made a decision that would change everything, because using his knowledge of advanced technology, combined with Danny's understanding of human engineering, he realized there was a way to make the plan work safely if they had proper supervision and safety protocols. The conversation that followed was unlike anything in Zekthar's experience because, instead of simply dismissing the children's ideas, Hayes listened carefully to their technical explanations and asked detailed questions about their proposed modifications, which showed how humans valued good ideas regardless of who suggested them. Ben, Chen, and the other engineering staff joined the discussion, and soon the entire colony was involved in refining and improving the children's basic concept. And what amazed Zekthar was how naturally the humans collaborated across age groups, with ideas flowing freely between children and adults. Ben admitted that the harmonic resonator concept was brilliant, and he never would have thought of using environmental system harmonics to stabilize the power flow, while Dr. Park added her medical expertise to ensure the energy pulse would not harm the operators. As the asteroid drew closer, teams of colonists worked frantically to modify the communication array, and Zekthar found himself directing technical modifications that combined advanced energy principles with human engineering ingenuity in ways that should not have been possible. Dr. Park asked Danny how he knew so much about crystal matrices, and Zekthar replied honestly that he just saw how the energy wanted to flow using concepts that Danny's young mind could not fully understand but somehow accepted without question. With 2 hours remaining before impact, the modified weapon was ready for testing, and the entire colony held its breath as Kyle initiated the startup sequence, with adult engineers monitoring every system for signs of dangerous overload that could kill them all. The first test pulse worked perfectly, sending a beam of focused energy into empty space with exactly the power levels their calculations had predicted. But when they turned the weapon toward the approaching asteroid, the targeting required split-second timing and coordination between multiple operators. Sarah Kim announced she would handle the targeting calculations and took position at the main control station, with her fingers moving across the displays with speed and accuracy that impressed even Zekthar. While Kyle said he and Amy would manage the power flow, Zekthar said through Danny's voice that he would monitor the crystal matrix and make adjustments as needed while taking position at the most technically complex station that required knowledge no human child should have possessed as the moment of firing approached. Captain Hayes made a final announcement, telling everyone not directly involved in the deflection operation to take shelter in emergency bunkers, because if the plan did not work, they would need survivors to rebuild whatever was left. But instead of seeking shelter, the colonists gathered around the command center to watch their children attempt to save them all, and parents stood behind their sons and daughters, offering quiet encouragement and technical advice as the countdown began. Sarah announced that the asteroid would reach optimal deflection point in 30 seconds, while Kyle reported that power systems were at maximum capacity, with all safety protocols showing green. And Zekthar added that the crystal matrix was aligned and stable, using Danny's voice to relay information about energy patterns. The energy beam that erupted from the modified communication array was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, because it combined advanced energy principles with human engineering solutions, and the raw determination that came from refusing to accept defeat even when facing impossible odds. The beam struck the asteroid at exactly the right angle, and with precisely the power needed to alter its trajectory, but the effort created another mental feedback loop similar. to the one that had originally transported Zekthar's consciousness across space and time. As Danny collapsed from the strain of channeling alien knowledge through his young mind, Zekthar felt his awareness being pulled away from the human colony. And the last thing he saw through Danny's eyes was the asteroid passing harmlessly by the planet and the faces of the colonists filled with amazement and gratitude because the children had saved them all. Zekthar opened his eyes to find himself back in his original body aboard his ship, but everything had changed because the experience of living as a human child had completely transformed his understanding of what intelligence and strength really meant in ways that would affect the rest of his life. Lieutenant Sevron leaned over him with obvious relief and medical scanners in his hands, reporting that his commander had been unconscious for 6 weeks, with brain activity patterns they had never seen before, and the medical computers could not determine what had been happening to him. As Zekthar sat up slowly, he realized that his consciousness had returned with complete memories of his time in Danny's body and every moment of human experience remained crystal clear in his mind, from the taste of Earth food to the feeling of emotional bonds that connected families and communities. He asked about the human child Jake Murphy and what had happened after their mental contact, and Sevron consulted his datapad, saying that monitors showed the boy had recovered quickly and returned to his guardian without apparent harm, but they had detected unusual energy readings from the planet's surface since the encounter on the main display screen. Sevron showed electromagnetic patterns that were clearly artificial, but unlike any technology in their databases, and the readings suggested that humanity had begun developing new types of energy manipulation, possibly inspired by exposure to advanced mental abilities. Sevron continued with obvious concern, saying that High Command had been sending daily requests for their mission report and growing impatient for information about the intelligent species they had discovered on the dangerous world that should not have supported any life. Zekthar stood and walked to the observation window, looking down at the blue planet that had given him such an incredible gift, because through the mental connection he had learned that humans were not just another primitive species to be studied and controlled, but represented something unprecedented in the galaxy's history. He ordered Sevron to prepare a full report for High Command, but said that first he needed to return to the planet's surface because his previous contact with the human child had not been trauma, but education that had taught him more about the nature of intelligence than centuries of exploration. 6 hours later, Zekthar materialized in the same Montana forest where he had first encountered Jake Murphy, but this time he chose not to use his cloaking device because if he was going to establish genuine contact with humanity, it needed to be based on honesty rather than deception. He did not have to wait long, because within minutes he heard familiar voices approaching through the trees, and Sheriff Pete Murphy was leading a small search team with 8-year-old Jake walking beside his father with obvious excitement rather than fear. Jake said he had told his father that the alien would come back because he could feel him getting closer all morning, which showed the kind of mental awareness that most civilized species took years of training to develop, but seemed to come naturally to this human child. When the search team emerged into the clearing where Zekthar waited, Sheriff Murphy immediately drew his weapon while positioning himself protectively in front of his son, and the other humans spread out in a formation that impressed Zekthar with its tactical efficiency. Zekthar announced that he was Commander Zekthar of the Valyrian Imperial Fleet and had come to speak with Jake Murphy about their previous encounter, and Sheriff Murphy said angrily that he was the one who had hurt his boy because Jake had been having strange dreams ever since that night. Zekthar corrected gently that Jake had not been hurt, but that they had shared a mental connection that taught him more about humanity than decades of observation could have revealed, and he believed Jake had been learning about his people through the same connection. Jake stepped forward despite his father's protective gesture and observed that Zekthar was different now, because before he had felt confused and scared, but now he felt peaceful, which amazed the adults, because the child's mental perception was incredibly accurate. Zekthar asked Jake to tell the people what he had learned about his ship and crew, and for the next 10 minutes. The 8-year-old boy described advanced technology and culture and society with accuracy that would have impressed expert scientists, because he knew details that he could only have learned through their mental link. Jake explained, too, his father that the aliens were explorers who traveled around the galaxy, learning about different planets and people, and they were not there to hurt anyone, which helped Sheriff Murphy understand that these visitors had peaceful intentions. When Sheriff Murphy asked what Zekthar wanted from them, he replied honestly that he wanted to prevent a war because his superiors believed that humanity represented a potential threat to galactic civilization, and they were considering action to contain or eliminate that threat. The adult humans exchanged glances that revealed their understanding of what such action would mean. But Jake simply looked puzzled and asked why anyone would think humans were dangerous, because they just wanted to explore space and meet new friends. Zekthar explained that Jake's species had abilities that his people had never encountered before, because humans had survived and thrived on a world that would kill most galactic species, and developed physical and mental capabilities that exceeded their own in many areas. Most importantly, he said humans formed emotional bonds that created collective strength greater than the sum of individual abilities, and over the following hours he shared his experiences of living among humans on the distant colony world. He described watching human children solve problems with creativity and determination that amazed him, and explained how human communities worked together with efficiency that military commanders would envy, because they did not simply adapt to challenges, but sought out challenges as opportunities for growth. Sheriff Murphy listened carefully and asked questions that revealed the tactical thinking Zekthar had observed in all humans, and wondered if his people were afraid of humans because they were good at solving problems. Zekthar corrected that they were afraid because humans represented change, and for thousands of years, galactic civilization had been stable and predictable with most species, developing technology to avoid challenges rather than overcome them. But humans embraced challenges and grew stronger through adversity. As the day progressed more, humans arrived at the meeting site because word had spread through the community that first contact was taking place, and people came to satisfy their curiosity about the alien visitor, and what impressed Zekthar was how calmly they handled the situation. One woman showed Zekthar artwork created by her 7-year-old son that was remarkably accurate despite being drawn by a child, and said her boy had been drawing pictures of the spaceship because Jake had shown him how to see things with his mind through the mental connection Jake had been unconsciously teaching other human children basic awareness techniques, and they were adapting advanced mental abilities and combining them with human intuition to create something entirely new that had never existed before. When the sun began to set, Zekthar knew it was time to return to his ship and face the most important decision of his career, because he had to convince his leaders that humanity should be welcomed as allies rather than feared as enemies. He asked Jake if he would be willing to come with him to meet his people, because the boy's presence might help them understand that humans were friends rather than threats. And Jake looked at his father, who nodded slowly after considering the situation. Sheriff Murphy said it would be an honor to represent humanity. But Jake's safety was not negotiable, and Zekthar promised as a commander that no harm would come to the boy and believed his natural mental abilities would protect him better than any technology. 3 days later, Zekthar stood before the assembled high command with Jake Murphy beside him, and the boy showed no fear as he looked up at the tall alien leaders because his natural curiosity was stronger than any anxiety about the situation. Zekthar presented Jake as a representative of humanity and proof that their two species could work together for mutual benefit, and the demonstration that followed changed galactic history because Jake casually displayed mental abilities that matched those of trained experts. Jake told the council with simple honesty that his people had been looking for solutions to problems that had existed for centuries, and said humans were really good at solving problems, so maybe they could help each other, which impressed the leaders with its directness. When the formal presentations ended, Zekthar delivered his final recommendation that humanity represented the next stage of galactic evolution because they possessed abilities his people lacked and perspectives they needed, and willingness to face challenges they had spent thousands of years avoiding. The vote was unanimous, and for the first time in their history, they would offer alliance to a species that had never requested their protection or assistance because they recognized that humans had something valuable to contribute to galactic civilization. As Zekthar and Jake returned to Earth together, the boy looked up at his alien friend with a smile that contained all the optimism and determination that made humanity special, and asked if this was going to be the start of something really amazing. Zekthar looked down at the child who had taught him that strength comes not from avoiding challenges, but